but perhaps what's changed has already changed. We just haven't seen it yet, and we are moving, towards a new time. And theater, performance, dramaturgy, and the arts have always been very close to it. Actually, people study this to see, because you earlier on could notice what was the time really about. It manifests itself. That what Adorno and so many others philosophers said, that's why we are so close to the arts. And artists have been on the right side of history, on the right side of change. They were on the right side of the complex struggle for freedom and freedom of speech. And I think this is the same again. And this is why we listen since March to artists. Since September, we also opened the field, and we at the Segal think there is an enlarged understanding of theater and performance and what art means, theater arts, and producers, dramaturgs, curators, literary managers are artists. They are collaging, they are putting things together, they are part of the team, the collaborative work that has become, I think, much, much more important also as a mark of contemporary good theater. And dramaturgs have been at the forefront. It's such a big field, a complicated field, a tradition of hundreds of years, a shorter one in the US. And I personally always thought that they are the guider, the people who guide you, like the stalkers in Tarkovsky's Zone, who bring you to the room. And then you have to choose if you get in or not, whether you are the director or the audience member, the sponsor or whoever. And with us today, we have two pioneering dramaturgs from the Americas here, and we know, of course, it's the US and it's in New York City, and we have with us two great artists, theater artists. It is Sydne, Mahone, and Cattaneo, and I will say a few things about them, and then we will go right away into the discussion. But so you have a little context, we also have many international listeners, and they have no idea what a Lincoln Center Theater is, and if it's bigger or not than St. Mark's Church Theater. And Cattaneo, first of all, thank you for being here. Sydne, Mahone, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And Cattaneo is the dramaturg of Lincoln Center Theater, and many of us think it is, if there is a national theater in the United States, it's the closest perhaps in the way that we have. And she's the co-executive editor of the Lincoln Center Theater Review, a brilliant publication that is, going on the tradition of Lessing's Theaterblätter, the idea that you give context to the complexity of the themes you show on the stage. And she's the creator and head of the Tony Award honor nominated Lincoln Center Theater's Directors Labs. Thousands of artists from around the world as a global initiative have come to Anne, who had made that possible on long nights to write applications and get grants to have theater artists, young directors from the entire world come to Lincoln Center for 6 weeks and to discuss the craft. It has been enormously influential, and it created an unparalleled network. I don't know anything that's compared to it. Close to it, perhaps the Royal Court, the international program by Elise Doctor was not as grand in scope, I think, as the Lincoln Center Directors, but still also very influential. But it was for playwriting. She was the recipient of the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs first Lessing Award. Actually, she herself was president, I'm sure, co-founder of that important American Association of Dramaturgs. She translated Bertolt Brecht. She translated Botho, Strauss, and many, many others, Ernst, Jandl. And she has taught theater history for many years at Juilliard. And she is the winner of the significant Margo Jones Medal that she got, I think, if I remember right, Meryl Streep gave her. And so she has dedicated her life to playwriting, to producing theater, and to theater everywhere. She is also the author of a book that's forthcoming, I think, next year, most probably, The Art of Dramaturgy at Yale University Press, so it's perhaps too early to talk about it. She also got the 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship, and very early on, and collaborated with Sydne, Mahone, and said, we need to have her. She's significant, she's important. Her work should get the exposure it deserves. And Sydne is an independent dramaturg and the editor of 2 books, Moon Market and Touched by the Sun, plays by African American women, and also with Ossie and Ruby, of course we know who she talks about, in This Life Together. She was the associate professor of theater arts and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. In 2019, she served as the guest editor of the Review, the Journal of the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, Lambda. And her production credits is a list too long to name, from Wilson, Dove, Wolfe, Shange, Lee. I mean, it's incredible. It's the who is who of theater she's close to, she's fighting for. And she is also a founding staff producer of the Genesis Festival of New Voices. As you can see now, we have a lot of experience here, decades of work. So first of all, you guys, thank you for joining us and for taking the time out. I know how busy you all are in the times of Zoom and remote working. We have less time than before. And so Anne and Sydne, where are you right now? Sydne, where are you?
I'm in Highland Park, New Jersey.
Yeah, and Anne?
I'm locked down in New York City.
Since March.
We've been closed since March, and we're not reopening at least till April 1st next year. We don't know.
So Lincoln Center might open in April, theoretically, you think?
No, for the staff to get ready, and then we would, I mean, it all depends. We don't know. But we're hoping to be able to rehearse, to bring our, I mean, if you go to my office, to my theater, everyone's shoes are still on the floor in the dressing room. Everyone's clothes are still hanging. It's sort of like Snow White. You know, a spell came over the theater and the performances stopped. And so we have to revive them as soon as we're able to by law. But we have to rehearse them a little first to make sure that everybody remembers what they're blocking. But we're hoping, who knows, maybe in the fall. Frank, I was saying to Sydne, I wanted to start because you're doing such a variety of hours on dramaturgy, with a little bit about how Sydne and I know each other. And really, there's one credit you didn't mention that is, I think, the most important in terms of our relationship, which was Sydne's association with the Crossroads Theater, a theater that's no longer in existence, but was a hugely important theater for many, many years when we started. And you very kindly avoided using the word old, but we have been doing this for a very long time. And I mentioned to you before, but I thought it would be important to start this way. I think it's important for people who are younger or people who are from other countries to realize, and that's what we always do as dramaturgs, we sort of situate things and sort of see where we're coming from, that America does not have a long theater tradition. It does have a theater tradition in New York, starting with the American Revolution. English troops came over. Just like during Shakespeare's time, they went to Germany and started theater in Germany. They're always traveling troops of players. You see them in Huckleberry Finn, etc. And then in the 19th century, there were stars that came, Sarah Bernhardt and Duza and Oscar Wilde, and they performed, of course, in New York at theaters that looked like English theaters. I mean, they went to Colorado and Seattle, but it was basically imported material. And that's through the 19th century, really. There's an exception to that I really feel like I should mention. And it's quite interesting. There were a lot of almost what you would call native plays that were about folk heroes like Davy Crockett and the American Yankee character, etc. These were not art plays. They weren't really that good, but they're very interesting and they deal with a lot of contemporary current events. And Lynn Thompson, who was later the dramaturg of Rent, started an organization called America at Play, which I think is still online, America at Play, which brought these texts together with contemporary young writers who adapted them. So there was that, although you can't hold it up alongside Moliere or Shakespeare or something like that, but that's about all there was. And the first American playwright is, of course, O'Neill, and he wrote 100 years ago. So our tradition is very new, and it is not regional in scope. And Lincoln Center Theater, which is a big organization, dates from the late 1960s, when the Ford Foundation for the Arts and Humanities started a very big, brilliant program to build theaters around the country. So Lincoln Center was built, the Dallas Theater Center, Denver Theater Center, the Taper, the La Jolla, it spread theater around the country. They had no idea what was going to be performed in those theaters. And at the time, I think there was a statistic that only 3% of Americans had ever been in a theater, because we're not a nation of, we're a nation of immigrants. We're descended from people who don't have an art going tradition, certainly a theater going tradition. So it was kind of all new. So they built the theaters in the late 60s. They were done. And then everyone realized, oh, someone has to work there. And so they began to hire artistic directors and managing directors, but the staffing was very small. And then by some miracle of chance that had nothing to do with any of us, but there was a larger sign of fortune, this just coincided by sheer fate with perhaps the largest outpouring of playwriting that I've ever heard of. Maybe you'd have to go back to the Elizabethans to find a similarly large group. And it was a group of playwrights, maybe numbering 100, 200, none of whom had trained, none of whom had gone to school. And all of them were writing about what they knew, where they were from, in very different styles. It wasn't a stylistic form of realism or some kind of, other form of drama. It was extremely varied. So you had, if you talk about regional, you had the California school, and we all know Sam Shepard, let's say, or David Henry Wong, who started out there, or Chicago, you had David Mamet or Steve Tessich, people like that. In the Midwest, you had, Beth Henley and August Wilson and Lanford Wilson writing about their world. A lot of writing which very experimental, Irene Fornes or M. Tazaki, Shange. Tina Howe started as a very experimental writer. So it was just an incredible upsurge of writers, again, non-trained. And so what happened is, because the theaters were there and nobody knew what to do with them, all these people started sending their plays to these theaters. There were no agents. I think there was one agent, Audrey Wood, who represented Tennessee Williams, but she was too grand for all of us. And so I think Sydney and I began because theaters just needed somebody to read a pile of manuscripts. And I recall, and I'll turn it over to you, Sydney, but I recall at the beginning of my career, which was in the late 70s, having to read like 50 scripts a week. Just so many plays were coming in. And it was an exciting time because, of course, when you're reading that volume, not all of them are very good, but some of them are just incredible. And so we would scout through them to find plays for our theaters. But most importantly, and that's the reason we date back for so many decades, is that we would occasionally find a play and say, I can't get my artistic director to do this, but let me send this to Bonnie Maranka at the American Place, or Morgan Jeunesse at the Public, or Sydney Mahone at Crossroads. There were so many people working. And so we would just send each other things and say, this seems like it's right for your theater. My own theater at that time, the Phoenix Theater, was a theater that was devoted to new plays by both American and European writers, new playwriters. So that's why I did those translations. That's why I wrote to Strauss. I worked with Mustafa Matura, who was from the West Indies, did a world premiere of his. We did some American world premieres. So it was a combination. And Sydney was beginning to work at Crossroads, which had its own focus. So maybe I could turn this over to Sydney to pick up the story.
Thank you. That's important.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Frank, for hosting this and having me be a part of it. I'm struck, Annie, with the way the history comes forth. Sort of an alternate history is running parallel with what you described, and I think about the roots of what we now think of as Black theater, beginning during the period of slavery. And the oldest known Black theater in the 1820s in the village, in Greenwich Village, the African Grove Theater. So that was William Wells Brown's effort. And it seems to me that so much of Black theater has a certain reference point during this period, because that was the beginning of what we now refer to as minstrel theater. And it was very much an improvisational act, but also a force of social critique, because it involved the people who were enslaved imitating white people who were imitating Black people in their rendering of what they understood as Black culture. And of course, it was very much about ridicule and denigration. And so for the Black people who were witnessing this and subject to it, it became a matter of them taking it into their own hands and reframing it so that it became a critique of white cruelty and white dismissal of the humanity of Black people. So that's interesting. And I think we're still fighting to there's no effort to deny that, because musical theater is a part of it as well. Its roots are there. But this alternate positioning of Black performers as somehow outside of the mainstream is something that continues to challenge us. And now there's a discussion about how we incorporate Black artists, and there's a great deal of crossing the boundaries, if you will, that has occurred, such that it may seem that Black theater isn't even needed anymore, because there are so many Black artists in all forms of performance. So, but this notion of dealing with race, I think is perhaps the common denominator throughout the history of Black performance in America. And I think the great thing about it is that one of its tenets is that it always be new. There's no way to progress if you are doing what someone else did. So yeah, everyone has to really find a unique form and a unique voice in order to break through this great wall of Black stereotypes. So that was one thing that crossed my mind. But also, when you speak about during the time that we met, yes, it was the mounds of scripts and the formation of literary departments in order to process this, and it was exciting. And there was a much smaller group of dramaturgs in the Northeast anyway, that really formed a family, it seemed to me. The thing that I was excited about is the opportunity to make different choices than places like the Lincoln Center or, McCarter Theater, any other regional theater of note, or even the smaller theaters in New York. And that gave us an opportunity to introduce some new voices. And that was always the most exciting thing, or to present new work from established writers such as Ntozake Shange. The great thing about having a small network of dramaturgs at the time that I entered the field, I was in graduate school and really just running a playwriting competition that was held at Crossroads, and there was so many scripts, and so out of that experience that we established the literary department. And the fact that the winner of that contest was George C. Wolfe's The Colored Museum was a thrilling moment for all of us, because it was extraordinary in its innovation in terms of form, even as it harkened back to the evolving tradition of Black theater. It did have elements of the minstrel tradition and the vaudevillian experience. But that let us know that there were many more new plays to come in that same way that the Colored Museum came forth. So I was happy to begin that process. And the other thing that was important to me was really finding and supporting developing women writers. And that became one of my major efforts. I think there were three, Crossroads started in 1978, and I think there had been three women writers by the time I'd come in the early 80s. And it was my goal to increase those numbers substantially, and we did, so I was happy about that. I'll stop there.
Well, I wanted to just jump off of what you were saying at the beginning. You know, it's because I've become very interested in this since I've been locked in my apartment for the last 8 months. It's very interesting today. Most people now, young people come out of colleges and that's their training. I mean, we did go to college, but there was no dramaturgy in college. We certainly didn't learn anything about it. But I've been surprised when you talk about the African Grove Theater. I'm surprised how few people know the history of things. And if we talk about African American theater, that's one subject, but there are other subjects you can add as well. I mean, where was it? Park Place. Who worked in it? You know, do people know about the Astor Place riots? I should just say this now to all the hundreds or thousands of people listening to this. I have been trying to get somebody, and it's probably going to have to end up being me, to interview Arthur French, a man who has a mind that is so sharp. Yeah. And Arthur French has gone through the entire history of Black theater. I mean, back to Langston Hughes. I don't even know if I don't think he knew Zora, but you know, and the whole history started in churches, you know, and the Hadley Players, and you know, do people know those organizations? I just did an interview in American Theater last month with Steve Carter right before he passed. Oh, wonderful! And that's where everybody at the Negro Ensemble Company started. They met each other doing something in the basement of a church in Harlem, and I don't know that that's ever been documented. And Arthur, who started there, but then has worked with everyone. I mean, he's worked in every show. It's unbelievable, his career. I mean, if I could find somebody to just help me record, I actually emailed him and, you know, we talked and I said, would you do this? He said, yes, but I don't, some young, bright person who is looking for a dissertation topic should just interview Arthur French, and you would have the whole history of theater. Maybe it's going to have to end up being me. I hope it isn't, because there are probably younger, smarter people who could do it. But it's funny that history has, you see it vanishing, you know? Yes, yes. And at the same time, you know, there were anthologies, the Black Theater USA, that captures some of this history. It's sort of like the beginning. That was James V. Hatch's collection, and he made it 2 volumes. I think it is more closely held and honored in African American studies departments, but it's not a required part of, you know, the history module that you have to go through to get a degree in theater. And so even in academe, the African American tradition is
run on a parallel track. It's something outside of the mainstream that's not required. It's an elective or something that you actually have to fight to get into the curriculum. And once you do, it's a dynamic and powerful experience because and you can never properly cover even a quarter of it in the time that you have. But I think that it's beginning to, I guess, we're recognizing that we need to recover and restore this. And I think that's a great invitation you sent out. There are so many other people who have bits. Woody King is a tremendous font of knowledge and history. But it was in the 70s or 60s and 70s that the small Black theaters came into existence, and a lot of the Black playwrights were able to come through there, like Penumbra, August Wilson coming through Penumbra, and Woody's New Federal. There's so many, I'm sorry, I'm not able to just name them at the moment. My mind is racing. It's so full of issues that are raised with this topic. But all I can say is that, yes, there's yet much to recover and to place into the canon in a respectable way. And I am definitely inspired by all that you're doing, and to just even capture what dramaturgy has wrought in this country. And it's a great clue to what so many of us can do in this time where we're not able to make new theater, but we can certainly take some space and record what we have done. Because even as the 19th century and 20th century has yet to be fully unearthed, this period that we came through is also not documented in a comprehensive way. And I've often thought of it as something that is in my wheelhouse, because of course I've thought often about just writing about crossroads, and that in itself has an incredible arc of evolution in the writers that were produced there. Just in my own experience, it started with George C. Wolfe and ended with August Wilson and Rita Dove, and a whole lot of variation in between there. The comedic writers, the hip hop writers. So there's so much to just capture, preserve, and lift up.
Yeah, and Sydney, I think not only just building on that, you know, I think what's interesting now, if we're talking together in 2020 about, you know, where we are and you know, what people know and what people don't. What's interesting to me is how little people who are entering the field know about so many things in our past. So you've talked just now very eloquently about your own experience, but I know, I mean, I'm involved in this thing called the Sustaining Legacy Project, which is a new initiative that the Dramatists Guild Foundation is overseeing, which there's so many recognized, award-winning, popular with audiences playwrights still alive who have just vanished into obscurity. Mm-hmm. And maybe they were ahead of their time. I mean, they were popular, but young people don't seem to know their work. So we're giving out awards. National New Play Network is joining us. They're going to be touring, you know, offering these writers productions. I can't tell you who the first winners are because we haven't announced them yet.
Right.
It keeps getting put off, but you'll know who they are. They're very interesting, so people should look for that. But Marcia Norman has started an initiative, which was kind of shocking to me, of all the women playwrights that we worked with who've also been forgotten. And this isn't just a 20th century phenomenon. It isn't just since the 1970s. I mean, if you go back into, so I'm very into the classics and Shakespeare and stuff, if you go back to, you know, writers like Margaret Cavendish, who wrote in, can't even remember when, 1680 or something, nobody knows who she is. So there are a lot of amazing writers who have been forgotten, who haven't been brought to life, or etc. And that to me seems, as I gradually leave the field, something that people, you don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. Of course, you will reinvent the wheel because you have your own sensibility, but there are things to be mined. There are things that can be adapted. There are things that can be brought back. Because ultimately what you have to have, which we know from our own experience, is you have to have a joyful group of collaborators who love each other and are free and really like the work. And then you have to have an audience.
Yes.
If you just have 6 people who are your friends who like the same thing, it's not going to go anywhere. Right. You've got to find work. So you start with somebody you like George Wolfe, and then an awful lot of people like that work. And there begins a whole story. And so that seems to me harder to do when you cut off the tradition from the past because you just don't know it.
Right. The tradition is so important. For some reason, I'm thinking of Morgan Jeunesse. You and Morgan were like my big sisters when I came in, because you all had already established your departments and the processes to make it work, sort of the protocols, if you will. And from the response letters to playwrights or the calls.
We answered them all.
Yes. Well, I tried. It got ahead of me, but.
And we should add, Morgan Jeunesse was the dramaturg at the Public Theater. She worked for Joseph Papp,
Yes.
Yeah, she was on Segal Talks, yeah.
And so that network just continued to expand. But the point I guess I want to make is that there's the process of making the work that we are now challenged to reinvent at this moment in history. How do you make work whose future is unknown at this time? And then there's the process of preserving what has been done. Both things are important, but they seem to be two different initiatives, if you will. And I'm concerned about both, but as you say, Annie, as we kind of see the exits for our careers, it's very important that we preserve what happened on our watch, if you will.
What was your journey from both of you? How did you get to become a dramaturg?
Anne, do you want to start?
Not particularly. I've just written this book, and I obviously have to deal with it. And I actually don't really know. I mean, I had lived when I was young, like a 16-year-old. I lived in Germany. I went to the theater, but I had no interest in theater. I've never been interested in acting or whatever. I went to concerts. I did all kinds of other things, but I had no particular interest. So maybe I knew something about it from then. I don't know. I knew I didn't want to act. As I always say, there are two kinds of people in the theater: the people who will do anything to get on a stage, and the people who will do anything to get off a stage. I was definitely in the latter category. And so I didn't really know what to do. I wrote criticism, and then I did a little directing. I was a very good seamstress. I did a lot of work in costume shops. That's always very useful. You learn everything about a theater when you just keep your head down in the costume shop. You know everything that's going on. And then I did a little directing, but, finding myself at midnight taking a phone call from an actor and hearing myself saying, "But you're wonderful at the show." I thought, you know what? I think I'll let somebody else do this. So I think it really just came down to, I taught for a while. I got a job, like you did. You find yourself in a job, and then there were all these scripts to be read. And then I started realizing, oh, I like doing this. I like finding people. And I've always liked recommending people. And, you know, as you remember calling up and saying, you have to read this play, or just telling a playwright, you have to send your script. In fact, when we started this organization that's now very established, LMDA, Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. I ended up calling it Of the Americas because there were Canadian dramaturgs and Mexican dramaturgs. This has made it complicated. But we used to send out this script exchange. Do you remember this?
Yes.
We mailed it, you know. In other words, you know, I would find plays that I loved. Some of them I could get on at my theater. This was back at the Phoenix, way before I was at Lincoln Center. And others I just could not talk them into doing for one reason or another. We all were in the same boat. So we would type up, you know, I think it went out like 5 times a year. 5 or 6 dramaturgs would type up, here are 3 or 4 plays that I cannot get my artistic director to do, but I think they're really great, and here's why I love them. And then we would put the home address and phone number of the playwright and say 3 women, 2 men, you know, 2 sets, because, you know, there were a lot of small theaters that was important. That's another thing we should mention for anyone listening who's not American is we have no theater subsidy in America. There's no national subsidy. So we have to hustle in a different way. It's a good thing now, because when all the money has disappeared, we're totally at home. We're not used to having money. But if you look at theaters in Europe who have these lavish subsidies, we've always been in a different situation. We have to earn our money at the box office or through donations. By our tax system allows you to lower your tax rate if you donate, but we have no government subsidy. I was once I became friends with the literary manager at the Comédie Française, a very grand theater, lovely guy, Jandl. We did a press conference together and they were asking us about funding. And he said, oh, the Comédie Française, which had a budget sort of like Lincoln Center's, gets 99% of its operating budget every year on January 1st. What about Lincoln Center? And I said, Lincoln Center Theater, which is one of the largest not-for-profit theaters in America, gets less than 1% of its budget from city, state, and federal sources combined. I think it's less than 1/2 of 1%. It's such a completely different situation where you are kind of going back to the roots of theater, where you have to kind of, you know, devise strategies to find plays that you love and your actors love and your audiences will love. It's a different situation than a very structured theater, which is what other countries are used to. And we're jealous of that now when we see, you know, bills in London for bailing out London theaters for €2 billion. I mean, can you imagine?
Woo. Well, this is a really powerful point to bring to light, because I think it definitely points to the problem that we're having right now. The model for the financial model is not working, is no longer applicable in a moment like this. And it's, yes, people are making all kinds of efforts to find alternative ways to make theater in this moment, but without a way to, I don't know, meet capitalism. It's really shattered the way we can even think about how to go forward. And I think it's really a time for transformation, because the multi-million-dollar blockbuster Broadway musical is not going to just come back, you know, after a week of restoration rehearsal. I mean, it's not just the health issue that prevents us from all gathering in a space. It's also the financial model. And I can only hope that this forces us to re-examine how that functions, because that's also a large part of why certain people are excluded from it. When Crossroads, for example, hit financial problems, there were no major donors, because it's the private sector that basically supports commercial theater and really regional theater as well. There was no, you know, large donor to bail them out, and so things took a turn. for the worst there for a moment. They have recovered and are back in action. But I mean, it was a big deal that Penumbra got $1 million of whatever the new grant source was just recently, in response to the social reckoning that we're the racial reckoning for social justice. I mean, that should not be extraordinary given the whole economy of professional theater in this country. But we're happy that it happened, and hopefully it will create a new way forward. But
yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I think in some regards, you know, I'm using the time that I'm sitting in my apartment to really rethink a lot of things. Because I think it's a good, somebody said, this is what change feels like. It's this difficult. It's this, you know, traumatic. I mean, it certainly is traumatic, but you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I had cited that statistic that when the regional theaters were built, 3% of Americans had ever been in a theater. But actually, you know, a while ago, let's say 2015 or something, more Americans had gone to theater than we're going to theater every year than we're going to professional football games. I mean, people like the theater. And we have seen regional theaters really grow in many different communities. And when you have a city, a smaller city, not New York, let's say, you know, you want a forward-thinking industry, you want a university, you want some culture, you want restaurants, you want a good theater, you know, people like it. And I think for all of us, my own, well, I won't be part of this, but you know, what we've witnessed is when we met each other, the theaters really had a distinct identity. They had very specific groups of writers. They were serving, I mean, many audience members went to many theaters. They were just into it. But that's gotten to be much more uniform now. And I think it's because, my own feeling is that because a lot of theaters, you know, the building was big and more people got hired, and boards of directors know what a marketing director is and they know what a press agent, what is a dramaturg, you know, or, I mean, there used to be playwrights on salary at theaters. You know, Lanford Wilson was on salary at Circle Rep. You know, there were many theaters that included in the artistic departments writers and residents. And then gradually they got, well, why are we doing this? You know, that last play wasn't as good as we had hoped. They got moved out. And you began to notice in publications like American Theater, which used to print the repertory of every theater around the country. You could see what was going on in Santa Fe or in Denver. It used to be very varied. And then over a period of, like, let's say in the 90s into 2000, so the same plays would show up over and over and over. They were the plays that had won the Tony. I mean, they were still new plays, or had won the Pulitzer. And the same plays would be done like 50 times, as opposed to 50 plays being done, you know, and it became more conservative, and Broadway too. You know, you have just endless, you know, it's like Disneyland, jukebox musicals and Disney stuff, and the kind of plays that you could see there, and there were quite a few varied ones, even on Broadway, have such a hard time now. I mean, you couldn't get a theater for Serafina now, you know.
My God.
So, you know, that's something that needs to change. And also, as I always say to my directors, and this is something I'll end with for now, and then let Frank ask us a question. You know, it's important, I think, for young people. I always say to my directors, think about your aunt and your uncle. You know what play you want to go see.
Right.
But think about other people besides yourself. What would they see? You know, I mean, could you talk them into going to see the play that you're working on or that your friends are working on, so that the theater is not a rarefied, elitist space that only people who have gone to graduate school in theater want to attend. It lives in the community. You should have the mayor of your town come to the opening nights of your shows. You should be part, like Crossroads was a part of New Brunswick. It was important, you know. And fitting into a community. Did your roommates, if you went to college, did your roommates from college who went into whatever, law or something, are they supporting you? You know, so that it just doesn't become like little niche thing that isn't really about what's going on in the community. That seems to be something that's changed.
Well, I think your model for practicing dramaturgy is just extraordinary, because in the past few moments you've mentioned the director's lab. Now, directing is not dramaturgy, you know, in a formal sense, and yet the fact that you had the vision to assemble directors and match them with writers is dramaturgy at the next level. It's not working on a script, it's creating the infrastructure, the architecture for new work to happen. And I think that is still a challenge that we face even more dramatically in this moment.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's one thing that a lot of us have been interested in. I mean, that's a good thing about being a dramaturg in America. No one knows what the hell it is. So you can do whatever you want.
Right.
But Frank and I have talked often about international work. And I realized, because I was writing some copy for the website, at Lincoln Center's website, if you go to the Director's Lab, it should be up. This program has been going for 25 years. Amazing, because I'm only 40. And it is the largest, most diverse, most international, most diverse in every possible way. I've accepted more women than men in the program since 1995. And I gather them, and then I leave the room. And they're there day and night. They work 10 hours a day for 3 weeks. And so when you have somebody from you know, Panama talking to somebody from Atlanta, talking to somebody from, you know, Kenya, talking to somebody from Uzbekistan, and they're saying, or somebody from Rome, and they're saying, well, this kind of theater is really important. And the other ones say, well, what is that kind of theater? You know, that's when you really begin to get, you know, and I'm not privy to those conversations. I'm home cooking dinner. Stage managers are running them. But then they, you know, they work from 10 to 10, and at 10 they go out to a bar and they keep talking.
Yeah.
You know? Yes. Because people really want that exchange of ideas and different traditions and different, you know, and I'm very interested in people from different parts of the US. I mean, there's so much, you know, theaters that are starting in Alaska or in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or Hawaii. I love people who direct in churches. I love people, you know, in drama ministries. I love people who direct on cruise ships, you know, I mean, what are those experiences like? Right. And so it's fun to put everything together, you know. That's been a joy.
Well, you mentioned the international dimension. I think that was also important to Rick Connolly Richardson, the founders of Crossroads Theater Company, because there is such a thing known as the African diaspora. And so when you mentioned, and Rick is from Trinidad, so there was a connection there naturally, but also the opportunity to, so when you mentioned Mustafa Matura, I'm pretty sure that that was how he also came to us at Crossroads.
Yeah, actually.
And then Serafina was something that just completely thrilled the theater community, the arts community, and was so dynamic. This combination of ensemble and improvisation and precise choreography and precise text. I mean, it was phenomenal. And so then that, in a sense, led to our opportunity to work on Sheila's Day. Was focused on women, domestic workers in both the US and South Africa, in Johannesburg. And we had a cast of African-American and South African actors who worked with Mongeni Ngema and Duma Lova to create a piece that was taking advantage of both traditional forms of theater and also bringing it up to the contemporary moment.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, in my little bio, I mentioned that I have been with John Guare, the executive editor of the Lincoln Center Theater Review, issue number 77 for years. It's a literary review. Okay, how did that start? Before my time at Lincoln Center, as Serafina was beginning to gather its forces and get organized, I came when it was running already. The theater tried to get some press on Serafina. And it was before Nelson Mandela was released. And no one would cover the show.
Mm.
No one would cover the show. And that should never be a problem for a dramaturg. And it certainly wasn't a problem for John Guare. He said, screw it, let's start our own magazine. So we started the Lincoln Center Theater Review. He started it and did an interview with Duma and did an interview with Bongani and did a whole thing, you know, conversation with South African playwrights. And then when Mandela was released, suddenly everybody was like, wow, you know, and then we just had this amazing, amazing run. This is before we moved the show down to Broadway to the Court, where you realized the theater was changing history. I mean, you know, Bishop Tutu came. I mean, it was just absolutely incredible. And then all the kids in the show, when it finally closed, there was a movie made and toured Europe. They all went into The Lion King because that was just starting at that time. And the assistant directors were in the director's lab and they were looking for actors. And they actually have a casting office in Soweto. And just to end this story, my favorite thing is I was in South Africa because I put together 2 South African theater festivals after that of younger writers that we did at the Lincoln Center Festival. Very good work. And so I went to South Africa with John Rockwell, who was running the festival. And to be in Soweto on a Sunday morning with Duma, and you and I know Duma, in this purple BMW or whatever the hell he was driving. You know, it was very quiet. We were driving, you know, turned a corner in Soweto, and there were guys, you know, standing outside of Shebeen drinking, and this purple car pulls up, and the whole corner goes, Lincoln Center Theater.
Oh.
I mean, what?
Wow, that's phenomenal. That reminds me of a story that Ruby and Ossie told in their memoir about Ossie's play, Pearly Victorious, going to Broadway, and both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King attended the performance. And it was a satire that was a little bit, that made people uncomfortable, but the fact that they both came and encouraged or just celebrated the fact that artists have a different role in the struggle for justice and freedom and humanity, and that there is a way to prick the conscience of your community by even making them uncomfortable or pushing buttons that force them to stand against their own resistance, I guess, because eventually you give in. If it's good art, you're going to give in. But the issue, I also wanted to say this about Sheila's Day, which came after Serafina. So Mongani and Duma were big stars then, but by the time they got to Crossroads, it was an ensemble of women. And there was an effort that was successful for the women to also be acknowledged as co-creators of this work. So that would include Ebony Joanne, Tuli Dumakulu.
Joanne, my God, I love her.
Yes, you know,
Sheila's Day is about cleaners.
Domestic workers. Yeah, they were called Sheila in South Africa. But it was interesting. They both had Thursdays off, both in South Africa and in the US. There's so many, and some of the music was common because the Christian tradition was also part of it. But I just wanted to throw one tidbit about how I became a dramaturg. I think it begins with me as a young person in my church. And by the time I got to college, I understood that the theater I was interested in had more to do with the church than the circus. This notion of ritual, this notion of healing through movement, music, and ideas could alter your way of being. And that became a kind of fundamental concept for the kind of theater that I tried to advance.
Frank, that's it. You can't top that. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So you really Really true. And I think Rancière, the philosopher, said, we have to create civil ceremonies that do not reproduce the ones of the religion, of the monarchs, of the dictators, of the marches, of military. These are civil ceremonies in theater that reflects the complexity of the world we live in, includes communities, looks back, as you guys did, reinforces new voices, and creates, it is part of the change. But my question, pioneers of dramaturgy in America. It didn't exist. You couldn't study it. Even now it's hard to study. Maybe you don't even need to study it. It's also a good thing. But what is your definition if you would say, this is what dramaturgy is about? What is it about for you? Why is it so important in the theater?
I'm going to let Sydne start to answer that. We only have 2 minutes left, but I'm going to go get my manuscript and read you.
We have a bit more time. It doesn't have to be just an hour, so don't worry. Don't worry. But
I'm going to go read you the great dramaturg of the Guthrie Theater, Michael Lupu, made a definition that's so brilliant. I put it in my book.
Okay, you'll get it.
Well, for me, dramaturgy is the process of developing and fulfilling the playwright's vision. It involves facilitating collaboration, because quite often the playwright loses status as the other collaborators come into the process. The director has the control of the actors and of the clock, and there may be moments where, oh, we need to make this decision, make this change just to make it work in the moment, but it may not be in keeping with the playwright's vision. So fulfilling the playwright's vision sometimes involves this collaborative facilitation, and other times it involves pushing the playwright to remain true to the vision that inspired the play, or to remain true to the process that lets them know how to evolve through the play, how to change the play. There are other dimensions too, but when I think of dramaturgy, I see myself in the rehearsal room, observing the process that brings this project from an idea to a fully realized performance. And the challenge of communicating with an audience in the way that the writer intends to is part of my concern, that it be conveyed in the way that they intended. And sometimes it can be misconstrued or confused, or the writer thinks they're doing something that's not actually on the page. Those kinds of questions are always fascinating, because they bring out something that even I, asking the question, had no way to imagine how it would be answered. And those answers are often the dynamic discoveries that we all want to make as artists and as audience. Annie's back, let's hear it.
Back, okay. This is Michael Lupu, recently passed, who was at the Guthrie Theater for many years. And he said, to limit the definition of dramaturgy to research and gathering of relevant background information is to leave out its true vitality and creativity. Dramaturgy functions as a sort of monitoring device meant to keep the process on course, whether a barely audible yet persistent whisper or a vocally assertive and persuasive argument. Dramaturgy does not emanate exclusively from one individual who qualifies as dramaturg. Rather, it forms the underpinning of all intuitive or deliberate choices, thoughts, debates, and nurtures the passionate search for artistic truth on stage.
Well said, very well said. Yeah.
He's pretty smart.
So the artistic search for truth on stage. Yeah. And what goes through your mind? I mean, that was his, but what do you think?
I couldn't say it better than that. And I think, the wonderful part of it is is all the relationships you form on the way. I mean, one of the few places on earth, we're certainly living through this right now, where people have to learn to get along, is the theater. Maybe sports too, you know. but the theater deals with very dark subjects. It's not a happy play. The Greek plays aren't, you know, I mean, there's some comedies, but you know, they're about very Shakespeare, whatever. So it's not like we're avoiding difficult subjects. We're plunging into the most difficult subjects. The plays we've talked about just now in the last hour are examples of that. But somehow we as a tribe of theater people know how to deal with our egos to contribute collectively to that. And that, if you're able to do that, it's a joy. And to have lived a life in those circles has been a joy.
Well, can I just add one last thing? This conversation that we're having is such a wonderful gift for me today. And I think it's at the core, the very thing that all of us have to challenge ourselves to engage in. You speak about it in the context of making the play, but how else are we going to understand this moment that we're in right now if we don't continue to have conversations that are meaningful and difficult, and even with questions that are unanswerable? But we have to have the courage to come to the screen, the table, the phone, the 6 feet apart gathering that will allow us to have a conversation. It's got to begin there. It sounds so simple and somewhat, I don't know, just too basic to be real, but there's no other way to understand the self or the relationship that we now have to this drastically changing world.
Thank you, Frank.
No.
Thank you very much.
No, but just not so super fast. Can it be taught? I mean, Sydney, you're the great Iowa Writers Workshop, and I know also at the university now they have a dramaturgy, but you didn't go to it. So what is the idea? Can that be taught? How should a dramaturgy, you think, look like? How should it be? How should it be communicated? How should it be the knowledge transferred to a next generation or a new generation?
Well, it absolutely can be taught, but that is the foundational knowledge base can be taught. But the practice of it requires that you be in the room and gather and gain the experience of trying to bring a play into existence with integrity and with ethical I don't know what the word is, but the history is important, the documentation is important, the research for the particular project is important, and these are skills that can be taught. Maybe it's writing playbill notes or interviewing the writer, those things that can be taught. The part that cannot be taught goes directly to what Anne was discussing about the relationships. That is something that has to be lived, built. You have to be in the room. And it's something that if you are interested in theater, if you're interested in literature, as I have always been, the thing that you love will continue to lead you, because you know what it is that made you fall in love with the play, and you are there to, in a sense, protect that and elevate that, frame it in a way that allows it to deliver its full message. So I think it can be taught and it should be taught. And at the same time, it continues to be redefined, because for people who are serving as dramaturgs, say in dance or in curating art exhibits, it may play a slightly different function, but basically I feel like you're led by the thing you love, and that's art, vision, and wisdom, insight, transformation.
And I would just add to that and certainly in my experience, I'm sure Sydney the same with you, is that the really best experiences are when you are working with all kinds of people. If you only work with people who totally agree with you or you totally agree with them, then it's dull. It's when you are working with, you know, I mean, how difficult are the brilliant writers we've worked with? I mean, no, you know, but
Right.
but you gather in a room people with very powerful instincts and strong opinions and different takes, etc. And theater people know how to find common ground, and that's what makes it interesting. If everybody comes in having the same opinion, no one is going to want to see it. It's about sorting it out, like we would think about a country sorting something out, which is definitely not what we're seeing right now going on around us. I mean, I've come to the feeling, I didn't put this in my book, but I've come to the feeling that I did a production at Lincoln Center when I first came of Measure for Measure, which is such an interesting play and so relevant today. Well, they're all relevant today. And it was the most interesting cast. And it was a pretty straight up production. Mark Lamos directed it. And it included, you know, Lorraine Toussaint. It included Jack Weston, the great comic actor from Broadway and Hollywood. It included Reggie Montgomery. It included Campbell Scott, Brad Whitford. You know, I mean, it was Thomas Ikeda, Ethel Eichelberger, who was a sort of denizen of the downtown theater, gay theater. It was a really diverse cast, and it was taking place. Len Cariou, who was the first person, you know, he was Sweeney Todd. He was the first person to sing all those Sondheim songs. I mean, it was not only diverse and ethnically, it was diverse in terms of, you know, the downtown theater and the Broadway theater and, you know, whatever. And we all loved each other. And it was set sort of in a period in New York like now. It was during the kind of decline of New York when things were really rough. Remember the headline, Ford to New York, drop dead? You know, it was
right.
during Bonfire of the Vanities by Thomas Wolfe, you know. And that was kind of what that play was about to some degree. So we didn't really have to do much with it. We just had to, you know, a lot of hypocrites in that play, a lot of dissembling. It mirrored what was going on outside the theater. So we did it very simply, and it was very interesting, very relevant. But so, and we used to all have dinner. I would cook dinner for everybody, or somebody else would cook. And, you know, we were a company, although a really disparate company. And it was interesting when we would talk that everybody in the cast who was over the age of 50, like Leonard or Jack Weston, had not gone to college. They had trained as actors. So Len was at Stratford, Ontario. He was a spear carrier and had come up the ranks just like you do in Shakespeare's time. And Len had been at Jack Weston had been at the Cleveland Playhouse. And when you hit the actors, and Reggie was the first black clown in Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, you know. But when you hit the, you know, age 40 and under, everyone had gone to college. And to some degree, I think, you know, we may be at a point, I don't know, I have no way of knowing this. I mean, it's so expensive to go to college now. And if you come into the theater thinking that you're going to make money, you're a fool, because you have to come into the theater because you can't do anything else and you love it, and that's what your destiny is. If you come in with $200,000 worth of debt, you're just carrying a load. And at the same time, the regional theaters are struggling, and when the theaters were founded, a lot of the labor, the spear carrying, the giving lines to actors, the piecework that I did at this costume shop, you know, was done by people who were interested in becoming part of the theater. So it was kind of a trade-off of experience for labor to some degree, just as you would have in Shakespeare's time when you had and you know, the apprentices in the company who would start out and gradually play the small roles, but they would take care of things. So I wonder, you know, if that may not happen, and that training goes back into conservatories, goes back. You go to Louisville like you used to in the old days and learn about theater there, which would help the theaters, because I think it's too expensive sometimes now.
Right. The whole model
I
is
don't know.
expensive. The training and the producing of theater is all too expensive. But I just want to add one quick thing about dramaturgy. In some ways, our conversation has, it highlights the finest moments of dramaturgy, and yet there is this other dynamic that has to do with conflict, dealing with conflict within the rehearsal room, or between the playwright and the director, or between the dramaturg and the other collaborators, and figuring out how to let somebody else take the lead on something, or realizing that you may not always be right, or you may not have the answer. I see my role primarily as having the right question rather than the right answer. But there's that artistic conflict that also calls for a dramaturg to mediate. I think there's a bit of diplomacy involved in it, and we have to cross all the borders of each medium that comes to work in the theater. We have to know all the languages and be able to foreground the thing that is important. But this, the training, how I'm baffled by this moment. If somebody is like trying to just start college to be a set designer or something, the whole environment has been dismantled in a way that makes us have to start from the ground up, and that perhaps will be the blessing of it.
We have to rethink. Yeah, amazing that also the dramaturg is not just the references, but also the referee. As the last question, then we're going to go. What inspires you at the moment? What do you look at? What gives you hope? What you read? What you listen to? What inspiring thoughts you have? And what maybe a piece of advice to someone who's listening, who wants to be a director, a playwright, a dramaturg, a piece of advice. So what's inspiring you, and what would you say to a young person?
Well, I'll finish. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you to Sydne, because that piece of advice that you just said was so brilliant. I mean,
thank you.
If you have the answer, I mean, sometimes you do have the answer, but it's rare that you have the answer. But if you ask the question, somebody will have the answer.
Right.
And that has happened to me hundreds of times in my career. And you feel something isn't quite, but it'll turn out to be the strangest person. You know, I mean, it'll be a supporting actor who said to the main actor, "What about if you try it this way? Play it as a joke." And then suddenly, aha! And even the playwright didn't know that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very smart. It's certainly not having the answer. It's just knowing what question to ask.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think you know, what Sydne said earlier is there's so much change happening right now, and I think the desperate urge we all feel to be back together, to be in a room, to be connecting, to nothing more wonderful than to watch an actor at work, than to read a great play. You know, I don't think that's ever going to go away. It's never gone away. And it will come back. And I think we will see a different kind of theater, whatever that is. And that will be the result of the disruptions that we will have gone through. Mm-hmm. And I think that's good. I think change is always good. And we'll have to, I mean, it's really ultimately in here up to the writers. You know, they got to write. They're home writing. Just keep them writing, you know, because they have the eyes to see. And then we've got to be out there reading so we can say, here it is, you know, let's send this to this director, or let's send this to this theater, or let's do this because it's important. So I think change is good, and be interesting to see what comes forward.
Well, I think you're right, because the right play is going to energize, like just bring a certain group of people to a new level of action if it's the right play. The thing that has inspired me is, as well as just being always open to the new writing, is the fact that Kenosha, Wisconsin is my hometown, and the event that happened there a few months ago regarding the shooting of an unarmed Black man has kind of taken a certain focus that none of the previous events have taken for me. And one of the things that happened in the aftermath is that my brother, Tim Mahone, who runs a foundation there and is very much connected to the corporate and business and political community, much in the way that my mother was. He runs the foundation named for my parents, Mary Lou and Arthur F. Mahone. He ran the town hall with President-elect Biden, and my sister, Artist Mahone, who works in the school system as a parent liaison, parent-teacher liaison, she got the kids to paint murals over the boarded up walls, boarded up windows that were necessary to try to protect the businesses. So I say this because this moment of racial reckoning is something that inspires me in the sense that I know the artists have a particular role to play. I would often, because my mother was a social worker, activist, I would always feel guilty about being in the arts because she was trying to get people food and keep their lights on and clothing and essentials to survive. And in the course of this, I have come to realize that, yeah, artists are essential workers too. We're not going to make it without this other dynamic that allows us to imagine and to yearn and to root for and to get up and exercise our own will to survive. And that to me is where the art and where theater comes in. It's a real stretch, but that's what I'm hoping the writers are doing. And that's the writing I want to do.
As I say, amazing and significant, and all what you said is so profound. Even as you might say, it sounds simple, but it's the significance. Ask questions, don't have the answers. Think about your uncle and aunt. Don't have everybody who has the same opinion you in the room, but be a referee. Try to get people together. Reinforce voices. You select, you find something, help them. And also connect to communities who need a voice, who need a place, diverse ones, what they did. And yeah, to paint. Paint on the boarded up walls in our minds and our lives. And so this is so significant to so many others, what you said, and a great a call also to take dramaturgy serious. It's important. I think it was Ed once who said, you want to go on a mountain, you want to have the best team with you. You want to know where you're going and to find out react to the scene, the weather, this thing, everything, changing roads after landslides or whatever. So it is something essential. Of course, we do think, and we encourage everybody also who's even take this as a reminder, or question, why wouldn't you have a dramaturg? So dramaturgical thinking for your life, for your city, for your family, for the art piece you're working on, whether it's Sydne said, in the gallery, whether it's in a film, whether it's for theater. So this is all a very, very significant. Really, really thank you we went a bit over time, but I thought that was important. Also hearing both of you, seeing the friendship and love you have for each other, but also for your work, for the theater, but also for life itself. This is significant. And tomorrow we have my colleague, Professor Peter Ackersall, who writes on contemporary performance and that idea of the post-dramatic dance and the installation, and the art comes in also, like this idea of a kind of a new thinking about that what still perhaps is not even there. And it's always about that's not there yet, whether it's the law or whether it's democracy, whether it's justice. It's all about we are getting there. And I think this is a big contribution. Really, both thank you. Thanks for HowlRound again for hosting us. and Vijay and Thea, Andy from the Segals, and then of course for you who are listening. But I think if you listen closely what both of them said, there's something significant in there also for our lives, for our work, wherever you are. And let's take that really serious. So bye-bye, and really, really, really thank you, and also for taking this conversation so serious. And I think that's what we need in this complicated time where we really don't know where we are going. So this was an important conversation.